For our devotion this evening, we turn our attention to the Gospel according to St. Luke in chapter 12. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to you, O Christ.
You know, in reading that account, it can be tempting to write off the man who called out to Jesus, asking Jesus to tell his brother to divide the inheritance between the two of them. It can be easy to write him off and think of him, well, he must just kind of be a Ned Flanders type. If you watch The Simpsons, Ned is the guy who always has to ask Reverend Lovejoy, his pastor, approval for anything and everything that he does. And so is that what this guy is? He's going to a well-respected rabbi, and he wants his approval for how the inheritance is going to be divided. Is that really what's going on here? No. And he really does have something that needs to be taken care of. And in his day, it would have been common for people who had those disputes to go to their local rabbi, to go to a respected rabbi, and have him apply the law, kind of the expanded law that expands upon what Moses gave to the people in the Pentateuch, in Numbers and Deuteronomy, where there were specific words that God directed Moses to give to the people about inheritance. But this law that God gave to the people about inheritance was so that no one would get overlooked. It was so that sinful hearts would not try to covet anything and everything that they could get the grubby mitts on. So what's going on here with this man calling out to Jesus, isn't that kind of out of the ordinary? Especially in that day. Now, a word of caution, if you're going to try and do something like this today, well, your pastors are not the most equipped to help you handle financial matters. We can certainly keep you on our prayers and certainly direct you to other ways. But if you're going to come up with something like this, I think doing what Jesus did is probably the best situation. Not to do what he was asking, but to get at the heart of the matter. Why is this situation gotten to such a degree where this man feels the need to involve a religious figure? Is he coveting more than he should? I don't know. I can't read into his heart. He's just a guy in a crowd. But Jesus can, and he seems to understand that, well, dividing up the inheritance isn't the real issue here. The real issue here is an overcrowded heart. And so that is why Jesus tells this parable about a man who is wealthy and has a bumper crop and has so much that he's harvested that he doesn't know what to do with it. And rather than being generous with his great wealth, he decides, you know what, this can be my retirement plan. So he tears down his previous barns, builds up bigger ones that can house and store everything that he has harvested that season, and he's like, I can live off of this. I can eat, drink, and be merry. He wasn't thinking that tomorrow I'm going to die. He's thinking, I can eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow and the next day and the next day for years to come. And some of us looking at that might think, that sounds like a pretty nice plan. After all, we understand the need to plan for the future. We understand the need to be able to say that I know that I'm going to be taken care of, and I know that my loved ones are going to be taken care of. But that's the thing. In this parable, he's not looking out for anyone else. He's looking out for himself. He's concerned about his cushy lifestyle, not his neighbors. Not being generous towards others and generous towards God. Jesus is getting at the heart of the matter, and it is that overcrowded heart that isn't full of love for neighbor and family and friend, but is full of love for self, and so it's full of greed, covetousness over that extra dollar that he thinks is going towards his brother in the inheritance. Now, we might look at this parable and we might see the rich fool in it, and we might think, well, thank God hasn't made me that rich. Because, I don't have enough money to be able to think I can coast for the rest of my life. That's not the point either. When people are rich, it seems like they can never get enough, right? You can find quotes that quote some wealthy man. Sometimes it's Rockefeller, sometimes it's some other wealthy person who says, when will enough be enough when it comes to your bank account? And the quote always returns back something like, the next dollar will be enough. And it's always the next, always the next. And so too it is with those that aren't very wealthy either. We're always chasing after that elusive sense of security. But when we get to the benchmark that we set, well, the benchmark seems to have been moved a little bit higher because, we look over at what our neighbors have, and, we don't have exactly what they have. And sometimes we do it in the name of, I'm just seeking to make sure that I am able to keep up the standard of living with those around me, or I just want to make sure that my loved ones are really taken care of. But is that really the motive? All the time? Every time? Or maybe sometimes we try to excuse away our covetous hearts, our overcrowded hearts, because we think that we're being good stewards of what God has given us to take care of. And so we're saving every last thing, which in itself, it might not necessarily sound like a bad thing, until you realize that your basement is overflowing. You've got piles everywhere in your house. And rather than being generous with people and welcoming them into your home, you're afraid to let them in the front door because of the overcrowdedness of your heart has overflowed into your house. Those can be signs of an overcrowded heart that's trying to justify placing our trust in the gifts that God gives us and clinging on to them as if they're going to give us some sense of security, or rejoicing in the gifts that God gives us and using them appropriately and thanking the giver who gave us those gifts. That's what Jesus is getting at in this parable. He doesn't want us to be so obsessed with clinging on to everything in this life that we forget to focus on Him. He doesn't want us to hoard all of the gifts, all of the wonderful blessings that He gives to us in a way that crowds out who He is as the giver of every good gift. And so Jesus, rightly so, turns this parable around and says to this man who had this attitude of eat, drink, and be merry. And then he says, well, tomorrow you will die. And then what then? Everything that this man has been accumulated is going to go off to some heir that didn't work at all to enjoy it. Kind of sounding like what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes that we read earlier, right? Where Solomon was meditating on his life and was thinking back over his life and all that God had blessed him with and all that he was able to build up for himself in a selfish way. And he views it as a chasing after the wind, especially the times when he was apart from God. Because it does seem, when we look at the life of Solomon, that there was a time in his life when the wealth that God had blessed him with and the many women that had been surrounding him in his harem, that they seemed to have distracted him from the true God, and he seemed to have walked away from God for a time. But now, as an old man thinking back over his life, he's thinking about all that God had blessed him with, and he's coming back to realization that if it is just about this life and about amassing blessings, about amassing wealth and fame and fortune, then it all is just chasing after the wind. It all is meaningless. Because I can eat, drink, and be merry, but you know what? I will die, and then all this is going to go to someone who didn't earn it. How meaningless that would be, unless that's why it's so important that we have this portion added on to our lesson from Ecclesiastes. A person can do nothing better than to eat, drink, and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? The very God who gives us the food on our plate is the one who gives us enjoyment in those things that he gives to us. Without him, the enjoyment of these things is so passing, so fleeting, so temporary, and it doesn't last. It's when we view the gifts that God has given us as gifts from him for our benefit and for the benefit of those around us, and stop trying to find our security in these blessings, in these resources, then our heart gets a little bit less crowded. Then we start to clear out those things that would crowd God out. Actually, he's the one who does it. He's the one who did it by showing us how to live generously towards others. Our God, who had the throne room of heaven as his dwelling place, came down and lived a life of poverty, starting off from his conception in the womb of the poor Virgin Mary. And then exemplified with the first bed that he had in that trough for animals. And then living a life where he had no place to really call his own. And yet he was so generous with everything that he did. Always looking out for those who had less physically, and definitely those who had left less than him spiritually, so that he could give out of the abundance of who he is. Chiefly giving the abundance of his righteousness to us on the cross, so that we who have overcrowded hearts could have our hearts washed clean in his blood, so that we who are covetous and greedy and constantly obsessed with self would have these hearts of stones turn to hearts of flesh that are now able to see our neighbors in their need, to see our loved ones, and extend out a hand and show kindness and generosity. That is what Jesus is getting at when he says that where he desires us to be rich towards God. When Jesus closes this parable by saying, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God, he doesn't have in mind for preachers forever to start using this as a way to cajole their congregation to give more offerings. That's not the point here. It's not saying you don't want to be like this rich fool in the parable, so give more in your offerings. No, that's a misuse of the text. Being rich toward God, yeah, it might include remembering God a little bit more faithfully in your offerings. It does include that, but it's so much more than that. It's looking out for the needs of everyone in your life. How can you be a blessing with the blessings that God has given to you? The goal of this life is not to be able to build that bigger barn so you can store more and more of your own wealth so that you can coast off into the sunset. If God has blessed you so that you are wealthy, you don't have very much to worry about when it comes to your future, wonderful. Nothing against you for that. But don't think of it simply as, how can I be comfortable for the rest of my life, but how can I use this comfort and this blessing to be a blessing to others? How can I use the generosity that God has poured into my life to be generous towards the people that God has placed in my path? And you don't have to look far to find those people. They might be under your roof. Spouse, children, grandchildren. And you can expand it out a little bit more. See a neighbor in need. You see that single mother down the block who you know she's having a tough time getting enough to buy the groceries. So, maybe you stop over with a gift card for a Pick and Save. You have that coworker who's been out a lot because of health issues, and you know they're having a tough time meeting that deductible for their insurance. And rather than ignoring the GoFundMe campaign that keeps getting put into your inbox by other coworkers, maybe you do have a few dollars that you can spare to help out. There are so many ways that God puts into our lives so that we can be generous to those who He wants us to show His love in those ways, so that we might have opportunities to reveal the true way that God shows His love. The true love of God, which is in the personal work of Jesus, who was richly generous with us with His own life, so that we, because of His death, have the wealth of heaven waiting for us. So that we, because Jesus died in our place, don't have to worry about our sins, don't have to worry about our overcrowded hearts keeping us out of the gates of heaven and making it so that we're camels trying to get through the eye of a needle. No. Listen to your God and let Him uncrowd your heart so that there is room in there for Him to dwell and for your love to be shown, His love to be shown towards all those that He has placed in your path. Because when we have that love in our lives, we can truly eat, drink, be merry, enjoy all that God has given to us, knowing that, yeah, it's here for a time and we will pass it on to others. But how can we use it in this life to be a blessing to those in our lives? Amen.